Speak Out World. I'm your host, Jewel L.
And I'm your host, Dino L. And we like to first start off by thanking all of our first responders for the job that you're doing. We really are praying for you, and we really thank you for your great work.
Dino, guess what? On today's show, we are talking about carving out your own success.
So I know you have some type of quote for us today. So go ahead and lay it on.
You know I do. The quote is, don't ever think that just because you do things differently, you're wrong. And that's from the great American novelist, Gail Tsukayami. And so our guest today, as we even wrap up the month of May, which is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, but that's not the reason why I have our guest on today. I've been wanting to have her on Speak Out for a while. She is an activist, a community organizer, and a champion of equity liberation. She is also the executive director of 9 to 5 National Association of Working Women.
All right.
Give a warm welcome to our guest, Leng Leng Chancey. Leng Leng, thank you.
All right, Leng Leng in the house.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
It is such a pleasure to have you on Speak Out today. And there's so many things that I want to be able to talk about because you have such a great life story, and you've been involved so long in terms of activists and really fighting for justice, for equality for women, but for all people. So I just want to let the viewing audience get a chance to hear a little bit about your story. You were born in Singapore. Can you tell us a little bit about growing up in Singapore and then when you came to the U.S.?
Thank you for asking that question. And yes, I grew up in Singapore back in the 70s. I grew up in a really traditional Chinese household, very conservative and very patriarchal. My mom actually only have a third grade education, and she had to leave school to care for her siblings. She has a huge family, and so does my father. So, when my mom was, when they got married, we were very poor. My dad had a little convenience store in our neighborhood, and that's kind of how we grew up in the community. And my mom always said, she had 2 girls and 1 son. She's like, no matter what I do in my life, I'm going to make sure that, my children have the best education possible. And so she's like, I never had the education and the chance to, we always joke about this. Like if my mom had an education, she would be the most well-known artist today. She's so good at so many things. She's really artistic, but she never had the access. So, my parents had, like I said, had a little convenience store, and my mom, was a seamstress for a really, really long time when I was growing up, as far as I can remember. The lights would be off and she would be on that sewing machine, and through the night. And every time I remembered at the store, if my parents got like a $50 bill, they would stick it into, they turn kind of like an old coffee tin into like a savings bank. And every time we would get like a $50 bill, they would put that $50 bill into the can. I can still remember it was under the bed, where we kept it. And we all, we only had like a 1-bedroom at the back of the store. So growing up, we lived in the back of the house, and I actually did not sleep at that location because the room was too small. Plus I have an older brother and sister. So I grew up mostly with my aunt, my dad's older sister. So my parents actually finally bought a house when I was in 1st grade. So we were able to all move in. My aunt and her family and my family, we all moved into one house. So that was the first time I actually moved home to live with my parents. So growing up, in Singapore, the education system is very different than the American system. Mm-hmm. Most children in my generation, like most people graduate with only like a grade 10th degree. So once you finish 10th grade, if you don't do well in the kind of like the exam, the government exam, then most of the time you just leave and you find a job. So you can imagine 16-year-olds, they start working. So I was fortunate. I did pretty well in my test and I was able to finish what in America is known as senior high school. So I went 2 more years of school. But at the time when I was going to school, we had only one university in Singapore. So only like the top, like the cream of the, the top, like maybe 5% of the entire high school population made it to the university. I think we also had a engineering university, but only one for like humanities and so I didn't make it to the university. My grades were not good enough. And so at that time, my parents were like, well, you need to continue to go to school. So before that, my parents actually, a lot of people in my generation, they retake the entrance exam to the university. Yes. They repeat the second year, but I refused to do it. I was like, I'm not going to school anymore. So actually, behind my parents' back, I actually signed up for culinary school because I really wanted to be a chef.
Oh, okay.
So I went behind my parents' back. I signed up for culinary school. My parents were so upset with me. I actually did graduate with a culinary degree. But then once I started working, my parents were like, this is not the life that, you want to lead. Like you should go back and get a 4-year, your bachelor's. And, to be honest with you, when I actually went out into society and worked in the real kitchen, I realized how patriarchal and sexist the kitchen environment was. And there was no way I could be successful unless I was ready to fight, the whole way. And so I actually took my parents' advice and I actually came to America to go back to go to university. So that's kind of how I landed in America.
Wow.
Leng, you've had some very interesting management positions, such as the United Way of Greater Atlanta, the Center of Pan-Asian Community Service, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and Quality Care for Children. How have they helped you establish and build a movement to advance social justice and human rights for people of color?
That's a great question, Dean. I always grew up with this sense of injustice in my system. I think my dad, he always taught me you always got to speak up when you see something is wrong, right? He had a corner grocery store. The grocery store was always kind of like the hub where everything was happening, right? People would come hang out. So my dad kind of was the informal, I don't know, mayor or chief of a little corner of the world, and people would come and solicit ideas and talk about what was going on. So at a really young age, I learned that, if you see something that's not right, you got to speak up. Right? If you have the ability to, you got to. And I remember when I was in college, I lived in a dormitory where most of my friends were all international students. And I spoke English fairly well. So I was always elected kind of like the unofficial advocacy person, to go talk to the resident advisor if something was not right. If we had to speak up about something, they would send me, right? Because I could speak multiple languages and then I could also speak English. So I was able to be that conduit of communication. So I think, and after moving to this country and learning the way the culture of this country worked, I remembered that, how do you say, be on the receiving end of racism is it's like a common daily occurrence, right? Microaggressions are like a common daily, occurrence. So, pretty early on, I learned that I'm not gonna live my life and be a doormat, right? No matter what people say, even if my English is not perfect, I'm going to take every opportunity to speak up every time I see something is not right. So I guess I've been organizing, if you consider organizing your friends and the groups that you're in, since I was in
Yes.
college, probably. And that passion of like wanting to do more and wanting to do better and fight injustice just kind of stayed with me, in grad school and then into the workforce. I always knew I wanted to do social justice work. I just didn't know how I was going to get my foot in the door to do social justice work. And I was actually really, really blessed because United Way of Metro Atlanta actually was my first entree into nonprofit work. And
Got you.
I just never left after that. Yeah.
One follow up to that. Your motto, equitable access for all, is that where that came from?
Um, you know, After living in this country for so many years, now I've actually lived in America more than I've lived in Singapore,
Mhm.
and really like observing how the political structure is. And, growing up in Singapore, I didn't experience racism like now in America, right? All these years.
Got you.
And I think that, judging at, how the American society and the values of this country, when you're in Asia growing up, you think, oh, America is like this dream of endless possibility. Right? Like this like human rights country where you can live your full selves. But
Yes.
after being educated here and living in this country, I realized that that is actually not the case at all.
Mhm.
I always say you do not choose the skin color that you're born into, but you're definitely treated very differently based on your skin color,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
so like the slavery, the history of slavery in America is so deep seated and so deep rooted, right? And the systems that are set up today in the American society were not set up for people of color to be successful,
Right.
right? And so I think that's part of like my sense of like, we have to fix this. How do we
Yes.
go about fixing it so that we can have equitable access? Because we don't have equitable access right now in our society. It's
I
very
agree.
much based on your economic circumstance, like it's classism baked with racism, right?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
Yeah.
so all is systemic. So how do we go about changing that?
And I mean, Ling Ling, you see so much, have seen so much as an activist here in this country since you've been here, because not only have you experienced the racism just based upon skin color, but you've also seen the injustice that happens to immigrants that come to this country, especially women that are undocumented, women that are trying to work to make a living and unable to do so. You know, I mean, can you share a little bit about your own personal experience here in America and how that really developed your passion here and activism on that level as well?
I think, like I said, growing up and outside of America in a different country, you always have this view of America is the land of opportunity and the land of possibilities, right?
Mm.
So I think many people choose to uproot themselves from the place that they grow up because they are probably not as many opportunities for them to come to this land of opportunity, right? And I think, but by the time you get here, you realize that actually that may not always be the vision that you had when you embarked on this journey. But by the time you get here, it's too late. I mean, you
Yes.
think about like you are sacrificing everything to have a better life for your family, and you bring your children and you come to this country and seeking a better life. But after you get here, if things are not the case, everybody has different circumstances. I hear of so many stories of women, bring their children crossing the border from Mexico into America because all the resources in their hometown have been depleted and they have no choice but to come here. But then how they get here, right? Many are enslaved by paying all these like fees or debt, right, to get here.
Mhm.
So, I've even heard of like, this is why I'm not a big fan of cruise ship. And I can tell you a story. Like, there are many of these cruise liners, right? They go into villages where they said, okay, if you come and work on the ship for an extended number of time, you get this much money. Right. But then you
Yes.
got to pay the headhunter that sum of money to be able to get your paperwork so that you can come on the cruise ship. But then the living circumstance and the work, how do you say, what the work is when you actually get on the cruise ship it's really inhumane. The living conditions are not, what I think is acceptable. If I were to work on the cruise ship, and by the time you take away the expenses that they have to pay, that headhunt,
Yes.
the fees that they had to pay, by the time
Absolutely.
the money that they earn is pennies that's going back to their families. So there are so many women that think that they can have a better opportunity, but when they actually get here, that's not always the case. But it's too late. What do? So you have to make, I would consider myself like your friend Sharon is kind of a MacGyver attitude, right? You just got to make do. I say this like, immigrants and people of color, we are so good at hustling because we're used to. We have to hustle all the time to make it work, right? So when you're faced with those difficult choices and decisions, what do? You hustle to make it work. So unfortunately, for many, many people that are living in this country who do not have papers, they are even worse. They don't even have half the access that we have access to.
That's true because they don't have the documents in order to get the benefits. So if you're here, especially as a woman and you're pregnant and you have children, you just can't go and apply for any type of social services because you don't have your papers in order. And so how do you continue to feed your family? How do you continue to work? It's all those things. And even though we hear this racist rhetoric, because that's what I consider it to be, racist rhetoric about immigrants taking American jobs. And that is not the case at all. I mean,
I was just going to say that we all pay taxes if you think about it. You go to the grocery store, you have to pay for food tax. It's not like it's not like it's a free ride to anything, right? They're still, how do you say, like they still have to live the life of how it is in America. It's not like if they go to the store, they don't have to purchase anything. They're still spending the money that they make and still paying the taxes. So I think, the idea that they just take, and most of it, come on now, like the jobs that they have, like I would say more than half the time are jobs that folks do not want.
That's right.
Who wants to be in the kitchen washing dishes? Who wants to have no health insurance and be caring for children?
And working 2 or 3 jobs with
working 2 or 3 jobs, or working, 18-hour days.
Yes, below minimum wage.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, Leng Leng, 9 to 5 focuses on voter registration and discussing voter suppression and how do we avoid that. But why is it so important for all people to vote, but especially people of color? And why is there so much pushback by the government against voting by mail for safety purposes, even in the midst of a pandemic?
It's all political, right? I mean, that's the easiest way to say it, but political, why? To keep the oppressed oppressed.
Gotcha.
right? It goes back to this whole kind of like notion of access and equity, right? Like if we can keep the poor, the people of color, the communities of color oppressed, they can't get to the polls, then guess what? Only those that have access to, face masks can take time off work to be in line, don't have to worry about losing, the time off that they're not working, to be able to vote,
Or
right?
die.
It's all forms of oppression, right?
Mhm.
If you get everybody able to vote by mail, think of how many people have more access.
Yes.
But the idea is to keep the people that are oppressed, continue to keep them oppressed, right? So they don't have a voice. And that's what we're trying to do, is trying to make sure that every single person in our country that is able to vote have a voice. That's the only way that we can change the system that was not set up by us, right? I talk about this all the time, and sometimes I'm like, this system does not work. How do we completely take it down? What do we have to do? More people have to stand up. But and Jewel knows this, right? Community organizing is hard work. It's like you
Yeah,
want people to be at the Capitol with you, but in reality, how many people have the ability to take time off work to stand at the Capitol with you? People
exactly.
have to choose between feeding their families and fighting for their rights. This is what this country is, right? And most of the time, you see only people that have access can have the right to fight or the money to fight.
Yes.
I mean, it's the same thing, Ling Ling, that's happening right now with COVID-19. People are literally having to make the choice between their health or voting, their health or
Yes.
work to keep a roof over their head. I mean, it's just those same type of those same type of choices that have to be made among people based upon really systemic racism that we have in this country. As a woman, as an Asian woman moving up the ranks in the United States, Ling Ling, can you just share with us some of the obstacles that you've had to deal with personally as you began to move into different positions and within nonprofits?
I can just sum it up in one kind of like one sentence. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the phrase, oh my gosh, you speak English so well. I
Wow.
think that sums it up for me, right? In like the years and years of working in this country, like when people look at me, I say this all the time, right? Like when I wake up in the morning, no matter how well my spoken English is, when I look in the mirror, I'm still not a white person in this country. I wake up in the morning and I'm still an Asian girl in the mirror that I see, right?
Mhm.
So that is the first thing, you know, people judge you based on who you are to begin with, right? And in this country, unfortunately, that's kind of like the first impression. People don't know. I mean, and I can tell you this story, back in the day when I was working in the corporate world, I worked for this company, this big corporate American company, and this lady and I, we would take the elevator up to, we'll see each other in the elevator, we'll say hi, how are you doing? For over 2 years, I was working there. And then I left the job, and one day I saw this lady in the grocery store at Publix. And I was just in my t-shirt and my sweats with my kid and going down the aisle. And I knew, like, I recognized her immediately when I saw her coming down the aisle at me. And she saw me and she's like, hi. And then I said, hi. And she's like, don't tell me. I know you. Which nail salon do you work at?
Oh no!
What? What?
Oh no!
I never forget that story, right? Is because that's how people see you, right? And I have worked in so many different places, so many different organizations, and I can always tell you, like, when I work for white women, it's always like, you are so good at what you do, you are so good, but you're never good enough. Like, you can only go so high in the organization and then it stops, because ultimately you're still an immigrant.
Mm.
So, I've gone through many, many of those kind of very similar struggle, living in this country. But, to be honest, you just got to keep speaking up and fighting your way through.
Ling Ling, there's a lot of interest and publicity being placed on the landmark decision Roe v. Wade regarding women's reproductive rights. How do you think the Supreme Court will rule on this important issue?
To be honest, I'm really fearful. Right? The makeup of the Supreme Court right now is not in our favor. And to be honest, like, when I first moved to this country and went to college, and one evening we were just, like, I went to my friend's house, and there was a car parked like on the side of the road to the place that we were going to. And there was a sticker that said, what is it? Pro-life. And I was like, hey, so, I don't know. This is my first time seeing a sticker like that. I asked my friend that was with me, I was like, what does that mean, pro-life, And she's like, so she explained to me, right, what, like, in America, like, you're pro-lifers and then the pro-choice. And, growing up in a country where abortion access was so readily available, like, it was not tied to religion, it was not tied to morals, it was tied to, like, people's circumstance. And that the government had no right to dictate to you how you should control your body, right? So it was brand new for me. And I was like, why do people care how other people choose and what other people choose? It's not our prerogative to judge people. And so, my whole notion, I always said this, I said, if I have cancer today, and I elect not to have treatment, not to receive treatment, there is no law that says that I have to receive treatment. So why is a woman's body electing not to have an abortion up to the law to decide for us?
Right.
Got you.
Yeah.
And so I do fear, because of what the makeup of the Supreme Court is and where it's going to take us. I really do fear. And this is something that I think a lot of people on the ground are organizing. But I think because of how the majority of the country and the religion that is embedded in, Christianity, and I think so, I still think that, even though America is this land of the free, it's not that free after all. Because your freedom is dictated mostly, predominantly, by white people that set up those laws to dictate to us what is right and what is wrong in their perspective.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Ling Ling, this has been an awesome conversation. I can't believe that a half an hour is going by so fast. There are two questions before we let you go. First of all, in addition to your work as an activist, you're also an artist. So has this pandemic helped to inspire any new artwork or any new art form during this particular time for you?
Well, I don't do way too much art because normally I don't have the time, but I do like to create poetry. That's one of the things that I like to do.
Go spit something.
Oh, I can't right now. On the spot.
Okay, all right.
But Jewel knows that one of my live goals that I joke about is to have a one-woman show in Las Vegas. That's on my bucket.
Oh, wow.
So I'm trying to curate all my material so that I can be prepared when that time comes.
That's right. And look, and we will have first row seats, Dino and I, at that comedy concert, because I know it's going to be funny. Because That's just the other side of your activism. Ling Ling, before we go, is there anything that you would want to share with our Speak Out World podcast viewers just about activism or what's going on today with COVID-19, or just anything on your heart that you would like to share with the audience?
I would just say to folks that are out there and like listening to this podcast, now is the time for us to give our best self back to the community. Whether it's if you have the money, donate something, because there are a lot of people out there that are going to need our help.
Yes.
If you have time, find something that you can invest in helping somebody else out with. Like now is the time to really show that we can do this with or without the federal government. Right? Unfortunately, all the state government, all the local governments, like this is the time when you really have to reach out to your neighbor and ask them, do you need me to pick up your groceries? Like what little acts of kindness, I think, is the only way that is going to help many survive this COVID-19.
Wow.
And also to thank all the people that are on the front lines that are sacrificing for us every day.
Absolutely.
And Ling Ling, I want to thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely.
Again, Ling Ling, Executive Director of 9 to 5 National Association of Working Women. And if you want to learn more about 9 to 5, check out their website at 9to5.org. Well, we're signing out. I'm Jewel L.
And I'm Dino L.
And remember, you have a voice, so be sure to